will keep you posted. But for the Eric Duval for Ocean Beach Historical Society, by the way, good to see everybody this evening. Thanks for joining us. Welcome aboard. I have a few announcements. So we will be back here next month, May 20th, for Alex Bevel's story about Winifred Davidson, one of our very first local historians, as well as a well-known local poet. She used to write the Loma Lore column in the Beach News, etc. So that will be May 20th, which is a Thursday, 7 p.m., just like this. And in the next week or so, we'll put the information about that on the website, and then it will be in the newsletter when you get the newsletter. And then in June, we'll have our friend Karen Scanlon back with us talking about the Lower Point Loma Lighthouse on Pelican Point, which we still call the New Point Loma Lighthouse, even though it's been around for 130 years. So that'll be fun, and that is on June 17th. And again, the info will be on our website and in the newsletter. And all of these lectures, including Richard's talk this evening, Women of the Presidio, will soon find their way onto our YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube, search for Ocean Beach Historical Society, and we have a few things up there so far, but we're just getting off the ground, but including Johnny Wilson's great talk from last month about Florence Chadwick, local OB girl made good. But we're adding more all the time, so check that out. And always, if you'd like to become a member of OB Historical Society, you are to be commended. That is an excellent idea. Details also on our website. And naturally, it's one of the great bargains on the planet. 15 bones American, that's all. And it gets you our newsletter, several dozen karma points, and that splendid feeling of being a conscientious citizen. Our friend Richard Carrico has been joining us every year for longer than anyone, even Johnny, can remember. And he's back with us this evening to present Women of the Presidio, Stories Rarely Told about colonial and indigenous women on the frontier. Richard is a well-known local winemaker, raconteur, author, and historian. He's a teacher at San Diego State University. Richard is the author of San Diego's Spirits, Ghosts and Hauntings in America's Southwest Corner. Also, Strangers in a Stolen Land, Adventures in the Natural History and Cultural Heritage of the Californias. Ramona, I'm not referring to Ramona and Alessandro or Ramona Quimby, age 8. Ramona the Town, the Images of America book, and of wine on the Lees, well refined. I know how to say that. The history of wine and wineries in San Diego County. And even though you should be muted by now, please pantomime welcome Richard Carrico. All right, Richard, there you go.
All right. So let me tell you a little bit why, A, I'm doing this presentation, because B, I do something every year with you folks, usually in September. But B, in the last couple of years, as I would be giving presentations about the Presidio and the mission and talking about the archaeology there and the artifacts, when I went back and reviewed them for a class I'm teaching at State this semester online, I realized that there was almost no mention of women. And so I decided to look into that, and I'm doing a paper on it for a publication. So I turned it into a PowerPoint, basically. And that's what I'm going to do tonight, or this afternoon here tonight. I'm going to walk you through some misconceptions about women at the Presidio, and then kind of clear up some of the issues, talk about who some of these women were, and walk you through 120, 130 years of women at the Presidio. So two people in general have done more work on women at Presidios and missions up and down California. And that's Barbara Voss, who has done a great deal of work at the Presidio at San Francisco, and Jack Williams, who's done some work here on the San Diego Presidio. And you might remember Jack excavated at our Presidio, oh gosh, 15 years ago, probably, even more than that perhaps now, over in the soldiers' barracks and the casitas, where the women were living with their husbands. And so they've started to bring out some of this information, but I wanted to dive a little deeper into it. You know, as we used to say in the business world, get down into the weeds and take a look at some of the specific information we had. So some of this data is from a census taken in 1775 and another one in 1790. And then the baptismal records, because if you go through the mission baptism records and the death records and the marriage records, which are online now, by the way, through the Huntington Library, you can tease out who these women were and when they died and when they were baptized and something about their ethnicity. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to combine archaeological information from the excavations of Jack Williams, but also Paul Ezel back in the 1960s, and then this data from Spanish records. So if you've been to Presidio Hill, and probably most of you have, when I give this lecture or something like this to my students at San Diego State, whose average age is 19, so they were born in 2002, yeah, most of them have not been, and this semester even less because they're online. So I've got students in India, in Russia, in Lompoc, just all over the map. But for you and me, who might know San Diego, this, of course, is the Serra Museum. And when tourists come here, or maybe even, you know, new arrivals who move in, they're convinced that's Mission San Diego. And they go up to it and find out that, no, it was built in the 20s as part of this park, Presidio Park. So to orient you, this is basically Taylor Street down below us here, pretty much where it is today when you take that exit off the freeway. And then Highway 8 is out here in the farmland, basically. And this is the parking lot today. This is obviously an aerial photograph. And so in some talks that I've given to the OB Society in the past, we've talked about the chapel. So these mounds of earth that you see here before they were covered up and grassed over, this was the first mission in Alta California. It's also the second because they built two on the hill ultimately. So I'm not picking on the mission out there in Mission Valley and their sign that says California's first mission. They mean the name San Diego de Alcalá was Alta California's first mission, but the first mission was right here. And then the burial ground was out here that we'll be talking about. This was the commandant's house under the Filipino cross here. And then an archaeologist in 1927-28 actually did some archaeology out here, a guy named Percy Broll. He was actually a city engineer. And he exposed, if I could enlarge this, but I'm not going to, these are the walls of buildings that were under the dirt. Because when George Marston established this park, he had dirt brought in from the foot of the hill and covered up everything. And that's why you don't see definition on the mission buildings, because they've been covered with 2 to 3 feet of dirt. So in the 20s, a couple excavations were done. And then, if you remember, this is where Jack Williams was excavating about 15 years ago. So these are the barracks. And then there are also individual casitas where soldiers and their wives lived and raised their children. This was the parade ground, if you will, out here. So part of what we're going to talk about today is some of these women, in particular, one I'm going to mention at the end, was a Native American, Akumai, from the South Bay, from a village down near the salt works, where the salt works is today. And there was a village called La Punta, also called Chiap in Kumai. And she was married in this chapel, in this very chapel. And so this reconstruction was based on about 12 years of archaeology done by San Diego State, and pre-computer, pre-digitizing, I think pre-everything, it seems like. What we did is we had an empty room at San Diego State, and we took, I don't know, 350 log books from the archaeologists who dug there over the years, Xeroxed pages out of them that showed, you know, maybe they dug a pit right here and they found part of the rail. Maybe they found part of this, what's called a pilaster base. Maybe they found some drawings on the wall, because there was actually floral patterns at the base, on the baseboard. I dug part of the altar. So we took all those and we literally wrapped them around the room and reconstructed graphically what the Presidio was like. And then based on all the floor tiles or roof tiles that we found. We knew what that looked like. We had descriptions of it. So this happens to be a sketch by a German-Spanish artist. And this is Los Cabos down in the southern tip of Baja California. And this is the Mission Santiago. This is very close to what the Presidio Hill would have looked like. So the church I just showed you, if we go back, that's this building here with the little front. And in fact, it has the same kind of bell tower, not a bell tower at all, right? A couple bells on some poles, little side chapel, and then going back. And then here's their Campo Santo, their burial ground. And then over here are the soldiers' barracks, the wall around it. Very, very similar. And then these orchards and gardens would have been at the foot of Presidio Hill, where the homeless people kind of hang out today. So there's a big clash of cultures that gets played up a lot. And certainly I've given some papers on that about some of the terrible things that happened at the Presidio and around the Presidio. Some of the Spanish soldiers were, even though they might have been officers, they were not gentlemen. And there were rapes and there were terrible things that happened in the back country out towards El Cajon and up towards Ramona. But I'm not emphasizing that tonight. Instead, I want to talk about more the homogeneity and the fact that some Akumai women and women from Baja California, Native Americans, married into the culture. And it was of their own volition. They were not forced to do this. Maybe they fell in love. Maybe they saw, a handsome man in a uniform. Maybe they saw some economic opportunity. In other words, all the reason that we all get married, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons we get married and then unmarried in some cases. So I'm not going to play up the clash of cultures as much as I am sort of this joining. And I'm going to use the word Spanish because that's what we talk about. It's in the Spanish period. But by the time the Presidio was set up in 1769, it's probably more closely related to California. That is, they're not speaking the Spanish back in Spain. Of all the people buried at the Presidio, or that I can find records of at the Presidio, only one had ever been to Spain. They were all from northern Baja California or Baja California. They had been born there, were 2 or 3 generations into that, when Spaniards, true Spaniards, Hispanola Blancos, came from Spain to Baja California or to San Diego. They said, these people are amazingly backward. They don't even speak the King's Spanish. They're eating strange foods and they're mixing with all these people. And it was hard for people from Spain to figure out what was going on here. If you've had American colonial history on the East Coast, it's exactly what British people said about the colonies. These people have gone native. They're eating strange foods. They're using native words. They're marrying natives, for God's sake, and there's this lady Pocahontas and she's running around. So we had the same thing going on out here. It's a blending of cultures. So I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between Spanish and California because they're truly more Baja and Alta California than they were Spanish at many levels. So here's some discussion points. You'll be tested on this later. The women of the Presidio came up from really varied background. So, when I've taught a graduate class and I would ask people about the Presidio, students, and I said, so what do you think about the women? Oh, well, they all were, they were all these beautiful women from Spain and they came over here to settle the New World. And I said, no, none of them had ever been to Spain. Oh, well, then they were this and that from somewhere in Mexico. And as I'm going to point out, yeah, they were from like 16 different places in Mexico, including Baja California. So they've got different ethnicities, as we're going to talk about, in terms of if you want to use skin color or ethnic. I don't like to use race because, being an anthropologist, there's only one race, and that's human, Homo sapien sapien. And then after that, it's skin color, it's music, it's maybe the length of your earlobe, maybe it's some other things, but those aren't race. We just think they are. So most of the women at the Presidio in the 1790 census were married. There were a couple of widows because the life expectancy back in the early 1800s was somewhere in the 50s, on average. So by the time you were 50, half the people born when you were born were dead, and the other half were approaching death, basically just like today. For some age groups, if you're 72 is your life expectancy, means half the people born with you, statistically, have passed away and the other half are still around. And some are going to go on for a long time, right? So there were some widows, but they're married. There were some women working there, Native American women from the village of Kosoy, down at the foot of the Presidio Hill, who came up and worked as laundry women or as cooks, in a couple of cases as nannies for some of the upper class officers' wives. And at the bottom here, I talk about the status, might surprise you. So there tends to be a view generally, I think, that women in Spanish culture, let's say Mexican culture, California culture, in Mexico and Baja California, were kind of suppressed. And it was a, very macho society, and men did this and men ruled this. Partially that's from really bad movies, generally made by Protestants here in America, kind of putting down the Catholic culture, truly, and books, and early Zorro movies, and these fainting women and the fandangos and all that. But in fact, they were very powerful. They were very powerful. And there's a reason why in California there is a division of property upon divorce, right? And women got to own land, and women got to inherit their husband's money or goods upon their death. Whereas in the East Coast, in the British system, typically in the same time period, that went to the sons, right? Primogeniture and to the sons. But out here, the system was different, and it always has been. So when you get into division of property later and we become a state, women fought very hard to make sure that became part of California law in the Anglo system. So a lot of status going on. When you read about the women and people of the time talking about them, clearly they're quite far up. And many of the, let's call them older women, the grandmothers, if you will, were called donas, which was like Don Carrillo, where you'd have Dona Carrillo. And she's very important. She's the matriarch of the family. And she might have had 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 children, many of whom died roughly young, but others continued. And she was looked up to in this sense. So here's a sketch of what one of the women we're talking about might have looked like at the Presidio. And I use this because I think it's pretty accurate. I've got a color one in a minute, but she's got her rebosa on, her shawl, very common. A lot of women, especially on the coast at the Presidio, which can kind of be clammy. People live in Ocean Beach, this, right? The marine layer comes in at 3 p.m, and it gets a little wet and damp. So having a shawl around your shoulders, even on a warm day, was certainly a good thing to have. Up here, she's going to be wearing some necklaces that we'll be talking about. And these are not I want to stress, these are not necessarily upper class women. They're what we might typify as middle class, but they're going to have beadwork, and they're going to have some maybe shell or glass or pearl-like beads on. And then hair pulled back in a functional bun, typically. So not like, Catherine Zeta-Jones or whatever her name was in Zorro with big flowing hair. It's going to be more functional. And then we've got some jars sitting back here. This probably is an olive oil jar, because it was used for everything. Some bottles, but not many. That's a little fanciful, perhaps. And then other kitchens. So she's got a tile floor, in this case, a wooden floor. Got some chickens in there scratching away, right? And very little furniture. So we know from archaeology and from descriptions, these little casitas had a little sitting room, a very small sitting room, and then a very small bedroom, and then a little kitchen, a cocina. But lots of the cooking was done outside. And when Jack Williams did excavations there, he found ash lenses and parts of ornos, of ovens, in the backyards of these establishments, these houses. I was down in Baja California at Akumai village last Sunday and got talking to some of the women who were teaching basket making and native plants. And basically, almost all their cooking is done outside. It's less smoky. The weather's beautiful most of the time. And so why would you want to be in a hot adobe house cooking? Now, inclement weather and on, you might, but a lot of it was done outside. So this is, a color version, if you will, and almost like little ballet shoes, but very functional flats, if you will, and has her shawl on, her rose. And again, you cannot see it in the sketch, but there is actually in another version of this, she's wearing a very small necklace and probably in some cases homemade clothing, but a lot of it was brought up from Mexico City or from Laredo. And ships would come in, Spanish ships having gone by Manila, and they would bring silks and fibers, dyed cotton, and they would be sold, traded for things that the people here might have. In some cases, money, but it tends to be a barter system. So these women made candles, they made handiworks, they did lace, they made a lot of lace. And so you could probably trade some of the lace that you had made for one of these dresses. They were also going out with their men and capturing seals and sea otters and selling the sea otter pelts. We used to have a lot of sea otters in San Diego. They're going out and getting deer hides. They're getting rabbits and making things out of rabbit skin. So it's a barter system. There's not a lot of money flowing around here. I think in the excavations, after 11 years of excavating the Presidio, we found 3 coins. We found 3 coins, reals. So I want to talk a little bit about ethnic and racial blending. Without trying to anger anybody, if you're a daughter of the American Revolution or if your roots are on the East Coast, if you compare the East Coast colonies with the colonies on the West Coast, the Spanish colonies, the concepts of race were very, very different. The Catholic Church on the West Coast, Mexico, Baja California, Alta California, encouraged Spanish men to marry non-Spanish women because there's not a lot of Spanish women over here. So it was beyond acceptable. It was almost pushed on them to marry native indigenous people. And that's because that's how they're going to conquer the New World, not by gunfire, not even by diseases, although there were a lot, but through intermarriage. So by the time we're talking about here in San Diego, 1770, 1800, there's probably not a lot of pure Hispanic, Spanish, Californios. There's a lot of mix, as I'm going to show you in a minute. And they compiled books. So in Mexico, they had entire books like this explaining what they call the castas. It's like a caste system, but not like India's caste system, but rather to describe people based on their skin color, based on their ethnicity. So here we have a Negro, very dark. Where are they going to be coming from? Well, primarily from Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, because you've got a Black population that was introduced there in 1560. And through some blending, they might have part Native American in them or Caribbean, or they might be absolutely still 100% Black from the slave trade. And they're going to make their way to Mexico by all means, sometimes by slavery, sometimes because they've gained some status, sometimes as workers, but they're going to come to Alta and Baja California. So, you know, he's dressed up. So I want you to imagine this. Do you think this happened in Massachusetts in the same time period, or New York, or anything like that on the East Coast? No. You had some free slaves, some free men, but they're not going to, by and large, be marrying into the white population. So then we've got, so that's number one. The number two is what they use the phrase Hispanola, meaning a person with ethnic and racial ties back to Spain. And then they have a child, and we end up with what was called a mulatto. And then there's all kinds of other variations. There's coyotes, there's creoles, there's a lot of different names that people fit into. And this book that this came from had sketches of all of them. And in one case, like this huge family, this extended family, and they're showing the different ethnicities. So I want you to imagine the Presidio then with African-American people walking around, speaking maybe Haitian Spanish. Then I want you to imagine someone from Mexico City who came up, an Hispanola, beautiful woman from Guadalajara or Mexico City, and she's going to be speaking a more precise Spanish. And then you've got a child who might have some accent of either one of his parents, but there were schools at the Presidio. So he's going to be schooled in maybe more Baja California Spanish, because that's where the teacher was from. So I sort of imagine this polyglot thing going on at the Presidio with all these different accents and dialects. There were some French people there, mixed French. So what I'm trying to build here for you is a very different view of life at the Presidio than we might typically think. It's certainly not conquistadors. It's not Antonio Banderas. It's a mixture of languages and cultures and Native American languages. There were 4 different language groups, Native Americans at the Presidio, women from Sinaloa, from San Fernando Velicata, which is about halfway down the peninsula of Baja California, Cochimi, some Cuitzan, which used to be called the Yuma, from the Yuma area. So here's one of the major points. In some cases, this is self-identified, and in some cases, the commandant of the Presidio would have made these decisions. But I want to point out that of the women, of the mujeres, only 41% could be called Hispanolas. Those are people who are assumedly somewhat pure Spanish blood. And I'm guessing at this point in history, there's not even a lot of pure blood, but they self-identified that way, or the commandant identified them that way. And then 24%, a full 24% were mulattas. So a mixture of Hispanola and Black. So in walking around the Presidio, if I could reconstruct that for you, you would see some pretty dark-skinned people, which would come as a surprise to some folks. And then 16% were Indians, Native Americans, and they're going to have their own skin coloring, their own body type, their own shape, sometimes a little more round-faced than perhaps some of the Spaniards. And then this group, Coyotas, this is like a mixture, really hard to kind of figure out. And then at the bottom is a mestiza, and a mestiza is an Hispanola and just about anything else that's been mixed down. So if you add up certain things here, you get to the fact that 59%, and versus the 41, would not have been identified as Spanish. So let's take a closer look. So here's one of the things you always hear. The Royal Presidio of San Diego was male dominated. Well, sure, it's a frontier fort. Well, maybe at first, because there were only 3 females in 1775. But then after that, by 1790, the ratio was 65% adult male and 35% female. So a third of the people, adults, at the Presidio were women. So again, if I could give you a tour of the Presidio, like I did with Elsa Sevilla from KPBS, and I walked you around the rooms, I'd want a third of the people in your imagination, adults, to be females. I would want some of them to be quite dark. I would want others to look very much like Native Americans from Baja California. And then a couple would actually look sort of Catherine Zeta-Jones, Zorro-like, Spanish. But you're going to have 80 children running around in 1790 because these families were large. And that's how they were going to populate the New World. They were Catholic. And so 80 children, or 46, almost half of the population would be children. So I'd want you to hear kids playing marbles, kids playing tag, kids screaming like kids tend to do, playing with sticks, running around the Presidio, right? Going back to the stables and playing with the hogs and the horses. And maybe, certainly there were dogs there. We found dogs, and we found dog burials for that matter. So the second one we pretty well already covered. The women were predominantly Hispanolas, women of Spain. No, about 41%, and the others were not. It's often said, and I hear this from some of my Native American friends, Akumai friends, that, your Presidio soldiers came in and married up all of our women, and it caused, trouble within the cultures, and we didn't have enough women. And to that I say, well, I'm not going to argue with your oral tradition, but it's not true. It's not true. In 1790, only one Native American local had married into the Presidio. Others were from Baja California, Cochimi, Cucapa, Cuitzan. So there was not that big intermarriage. Why? Well, because the Akumai resisted it. They didn't want that to happen. And in spite of the Spaniards wanting it to happen and the priests wanting it to happen, it didn't. It's just not true. Average age I know this is going to sound a little bit like Hollywood or something, but the average age of the groom was 38 and the average for the wife was 28. So I can do the math on that. That's about a 10-year difference. The reason for that was in Spanish culture, you as a male needed to have some degree of economic stability before it was assumed you would marry, because you need either a farm, you need livestock, you need a commission in the military, not just a PFC or a private. You need some status, and then you were allowed to marry. So it's going to take you some years to get to that. Whereas women, obviously, for childbearing, but also you were supposed to have some skills too, some kitchen skills, some sewing skills, maybe herding animals for that matter. Two of the women here were shepherds, and they actually went out into Ramona Valley and were moving sheep around and shearing them during season. So again, a little different picture. This is why you're going to get widows, by the way. If the average husband's 38 and the average life expectancy is 50, 10 or 12 years down the road, excuse me, some percent of these husbands are going to be dead. The widows didn't stay widows very long. If they were young, they married someone else. We'll talk about that. So the youngest bride, who I'm going to be talking about, was 14 years of age, and she bore a child the next year. And she had about 8 children altogether from 2 different husbands. One example we're going to focus on. The greatest gap between husbands and wife was 23 years. 23 years. The girl was 15 and the man was 38. That's a pretty big spread. So I can't not show some artifacts because, I am a recovering archaeologist and all of that. So here's one of the crucifixes from one of the female burials. I want to stress any of these artifacts or anything that I show you were from non-Native Americans. So I'm not showing you burial goods associated with local Native American people. They don't want that in many cases, and I honor their wishes. So here's a crucifix, however, and you can see Jesus on the cross behind here. And there's actually cloth that was still stuck to this because she had a burial shroud on. And over the years, it had leached out. I'm sure it was black at one point, or at least dark. So we did some chemical analysis on it, and it was cotton, and it had been probably dyed black at one point. So it was found around, the throat region of one of the burials. It was a 30-year-old woman. So in Paris, in about I believe it was about 1830, apparently Mary, the mother of Jesus, came to a nun. There was this nun in the chapel of La Chapelle. Maybe you've been to Paris and you've seen the chapel of La Chapelle. Most people go to Notre Dame, but La Chapelle is an incredibly beautiful chapel. It's right next to where Marie Antoinette was imprisoned. And so this nun was in the chapel by herself, and Mary came to her and spoke to her and talked about being devout and how happy she was with the way the Catholic Church was working in Paris and other things. And so this woman, the nun, told her story. It became a very big deal. It was in the newspapers of the time, and this medal was struck. And so this is Mary, as she often is shown, on top of the earth. She's got her halo on, and then it's the miracle of Paris. So we love these archaeologically. We love these things because they give you a great date on, in this case, a burial, right? So if this woman's wearing this, she cannot, in theory, it's got to be after 1830 because the medal didn't exist until then. So these are the kinds of things we really, really like. This is just about 10 or 15 years from the abandonment of the Presidio. So the miracle of Paris. When we cleaned this up and everything, I think it was made out of brass or bronze, I can't remember, but it cleaned up beautifully. It cleaned up really, really, really nice. Glass beads, lots of beads on some of the necklaces and around the necks of some of these people. This is not how it was found clearly. We had to put it back together, and we might have missed a few beads here or there. So again, I want you to have this image of these women at the Presidio, not dressed like peasants that you might see in parts of Mexico today, but rather having some ornaments, because virtually none of these women are truly lower class. They're somewhere above that. These are called trade beads by a lot of people, and they were in fact traded to Indians. We do find them on Native American sites here in San Diego County, but they also were used by the Native American, by the Spanish people, by the Hispanos. These were made in Venice, by the way. Actually, they're Murano, and then they were put in giant wooden boxes, put on the ships, the galleons, and sent over to the New World. And they were traded to Native American people for goods, to help them, try to convert into Catholicism. But also, they were favored by the women at frontier forts. And the women tended to like the blue ones, the yellow ones, and the black ones. That was sort of the flavors that they liked, if you will. So let me give you a summary, and I'm going to walk you through one woman's life. And I think she's just an amazing woman. So here's what the census data tells us. We've already pretty well covered this, but they hailed primarily from Northwest Mexico and Baja California. So what I mean is, by over the years, so we looked at 1775 when there were only 3 of them, and then we looked at 1790, and I didn't show you other census data, but generally about 85 to 90% of the women who ever lived, worked, died, got married, had children at the Presidio were from Northwest Mexico, from Sonora. Several were from the town of Caborca, Hermosillo, and then others were from Baja California, as far south as Loreto, because Loreto was the first church in Baja California, successful church, and quite the big colonial town. It was the capital, in fact. And otherwise, they were from other settlements up and down Baja California. They were typically 10 years younger than the males. So the good news for us as statisticians and historians is they are going to live longer, typically. And so we'll get to follow them through time, even after their husband dies. And we'll get to see where they ended up with their children and grandchildren. Did they remarry or not? Some married 3 times, because their husbands died. 60% of the females, as we talked about, almost 60% were non-Espanola. They were married to soldiers, because I didn't really cover this. So who are they marrying? Well, they're marrying soldiers, craftsmen, and in some cases, Native men. So there were Akumai women who were either already married or married a Native man at the mission, and they lived and worked at the Presidio. So she might be making candles, she might be making cloth, she might work as a nanny or a cook, and he might be a craftsman, a painter, helping keep the Presidio from falling down, whitewashing the walls. Maybe he was a shepherd, doing all kinds of things. Next year, or next time you want to talk from me, I will finish a paper on 3 Akumai men who killed a Spanish mayordomo. That is the leader. He was a Mexican guy from the mission whose job was to be the jefe, or the boss of the shepherds in the back country. And these 3 men, Akumai men, rose up and killed him, shot him full of arrows and beat him with sticks and buried him in a ravine. So if you know where Ballena Valley is in Ramona, I can pretty well show you the ravine I'm pretty sure he was buried in. And they were put on trial, and I won't tell you how that turned out until I give you the full talk. But it's an amazing story. They had a really good defense attorney, and it turned out better than it could have. My point is then, if we look at these Native men are doing a lot of things. They're shepherds, they're vaqueros, they're craftsmen. They carved in the wet tiles that they were making, the adobe tiles, their own designs, and incorporated those into the Presidio. And then the last thing here, people always say, well, so what's next with this stuff? Well, future research, we can compare the female populations of other Presidios and look, was Monterrey different than San Diego? The answer is yes, because it had more high status Hispanola females. So if you had a choice back in the 1700s of coming to San Diego or going to Monterrey, you went to Monterrey. Better climate, more peaceful Indians, and it was somewhat the capital of California for a while, right? But that'd be an interesting comparison. So let me tell you about who this isn't. This is on your postcard if you got the postcard. This young lady's name is Petra, and this photograph was made by my good buddy, John P. Harrington, in 1925. So I think a couple lectures ago, out in the church there in OB, I gave you a paper on John P. Harrington and his contributions to anthropology, which are huge, huge. I won't spend any time on him because I already gave you that talk, but in the National Archives, back in the Smithsonian, there are 680 reels of microfilm of John P. Harrington's notes of his work in California. Just phenomenal. 2 on San Diego, 1 on Baja California. So he took this photograph down in a village down south in Baja California. And it's just so evocative, I think, of the story I'm trying to tell here of the native women, at least. She was pure blood. She's Cochimi, which is related to Kumeyaay. And Harrington, who rarely went into description of people, said she was the Madonna and not the singer, right? But the Catholic Madonna, or the Mona Lisa, as he said, of Baja California. She was incredibly beautiful. She was gracious. I think she was about 20, he said, and she'd already had 3 children. She was a basket maker. She spoke Spanish and her native language, and Harrington knew Spanish really well, so he interviewed her. So I show you this because obviously we don't have any images except, the sketches I showed you before of women at the Presidio. But I want you to pretend that her name is Sinusin. This is the Kumeyaay name, Sinusin. Clara, her baptism name. Yeva, her first husband's name. He died. Bustamante, her second husband's name. And I want not Petra here, but I want her to be Sinusin. Sin means, by the way, woman in Kumeyaay. So we know a lot about her. She married a soldier. I think he was a captain, Mr. Yeva, Senor Yeva, Captain Yeva. She married him when she was about 14 or 15 and moved into the Presidio from her village down there near La Punta at the salt works and worked at the Presidio as a wife to Captain Yeva. Bore him 3 or 4 children, I think all girls, all females. And then Captain Yeva was on a entrada, a trip into the backcountry, and was killed by Kumeyaay, strangely enough. And so now she's a widow at like 19 or 20. She's a widow. So she found another soldier, Senor Bustamante, and he was described as a mulatto from Cuba. So he's a Cubano. So he's going to bring the Cuban accent and the Cuban way of speaking and his skin color, his African-American Spanish roots, and marry her. And they're going to have 3 or 4 children. So she lived from 1764 to 1806. And 3 or 4 of her daughters died, and they're buried at the Presidio. We may have excavated one of them. That's a whole other story, but we do have the death record. And then somewhere about 1800, a little bit before 1800, she and her husband, Bustamante, moved to San Juan Capistrano, and they show up in the records there. And again, he's described as a very intelligent officer in the Spanish army, and he's described as mulatto, Cubano. She's described as a very gracious matron, such, you can be a matron at like 35, a matron, and a good mother to her daughters that she had with her up there. And then she passed away, 1806, and is buried in the cemetery at San Juan Capistrano. By going through census records and other information, we can take and find her children and what happened to them. So about 1780, 1790, we can find her daughters, and they're at the Presidio, and they're having children. And then ultimately, I mentioned this to Eric and Johnny the other day in the dry run, if you were in Old Town and you went, Old Town San Diego, and you went behind the tobacco shop there in that parking lot that's to the southish, right? The handicap area, the handicap stall, if you will, in that parking lot is where Sinusin Clara Yeva Bustamante's granddaughters lived in an adobe house. And when they put in the parking lot, they found some remnants of that house, but we know exactly where it is because it's described in some of the records. And so her granddaughters were still living there well into the American period, So through archaeology, through marriage records, through death records, all this stuff, we can take this one young lady and follow her from 5 years before Father Sarah got here and follow her family tree right up until the American period. What happens after that? Through a lot of intermarriage and other things, the name gets so dissipated it's hard to follow. One probably could, a good genealogist probably could, but frankly, I'm not terribly interested once it's American period, because I've got other things I'm taking a little harder look at. So I'm going to make a good assumption here that that's the last slide. It is. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off, get rid of that, and hopefully we're all still here. So we had agreed, that is to say, Johnny and Eric and I, that if you had questions, and I see some chats going on down here, but if you have questions, I'll certainly be glad to answer any that I can. Hopefully, there's 42 of you. Wow, that's good. Because Eric said he was going to pay me $10 a person, so that's good. That's good. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So if I can answer any questions, I'll really be glad to. To me, obviously, this is fascinating, and it kind of takes that Presidio on that hill that's grassed over now and adds a whole other dimension to it. And last time I was talking to Elsa Sevilla, because you might have seen on KPBS her San Diego History Series, she's done a fair amount of work on Presidio Hill, and we walked around. I hadn't done this material, and I sent her sort of a PowerPoint like this, and she says, "Oh, we got to get back up on the hill and talk about the women." So absolutely, absolutely. So now you know everything I know.
Hey, thank you very much, Richard. That's wonderful, by the way.
Yeah.
And so, folks, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and just speak up, and we'll take a few. But I don't want to, we won't go on forever. Go ahead. Anybody?
Oh.
He was so thorough.
Yeah, it was interesting. And I remember you told me that story about behind the cigar store. We were just there last week, by the way.
Is that right?
Yeah. And what did we go in? Did we go in there?
We wanted a soda.
Yeah. Kitty wanted a soda, and of course they didn't have it at the cigar store. But we were right there, so that's an interesting factoid for sure.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge how I figured that out, by the way. I knew roughly where it was, and some of you might know Abel Silvas, who sometimes is a Californio and sometimes is a Juaneño, because he is of many different families, Silvas families and Osunas. And when I was talking to him about this, I didn't know where it was exactly. And we were in Old Town. I think we were having a couple margaritas in honor of Old Town and Mexican culture and stuff. And he said, "Well, come on, I'll show you. I'll show you exactly where it was." Because he'd seen an old map where the family name was on that adobe when he was researching his own family, the Silvas adobe. So we walked there in the parking lot and stood and smoked a cigar and honored the Yeva Bustamante family. So yeah, cool stuff.
Okay, Richard,
Yeah.
in 1790, when you document all these women, how many of them actually came with the original soldiers that came up with right about the time of Sarah? I mean, did they come in waves, or did they all come at once?
They came in waves. There were some that came up with, very few came with Sarah. I think, as I said, in 1777, there were only 3 women, and one was a widow, one was the commandant's wife, upper class, and one was a captain's wife. Then with the Anza expedition in 1778, I think it was, more women came with that, and then a lot came in 1780, 1790.
Oh, okay.
And as some historians said, they came with the cattle. So there was this big overland movement by way of Tucson by San Javier de Bac, and they drove cattle across the Colorado River and brought women with them. And then that's why there's this fluorescence of women about 1790. Plus by then, some of the women who had come in the 1780s, 1770s had children, so they're showing up in the records as teenagers or young adults. Yeah. It's cool stuff. It's cool stuff.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was an interesting story about the young woman that at the end there. She had a very interesting life, and it's fantastic that you're able to follow as much of it as you are. I think that's great.
Absolutely. If I knew someone who was a playwright or an aspiring playwright, I think it'd make a great one-act play. I mean, it could be longer than that, but I think, you know, especially if one could get a Akumai woman to play the role, if you would, I think it'd be a neat play, and you could very visually bring an audience in, and they would leave after that with a whole different feeling of what was going on in San Diego. You know.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I ask a question, Eric?
Sure.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating and for me, very enlightening. I think my only history of this to date has been from reading Richard Henry Dana in 2 years before the mast. And he must have been in San Diego in 1835, I guess.
I think so, yeah.
And it's a more, it's a darker picture. What do you make of that?
Well, a couple things. San Diego, the Pueblo of San Diego in 1835 was, as he described it, dirty, brown, dusty adobes. But compared to any other Spanish or by then Mexican town in Baja California or northern Sonora, that would have been a perfectly good town. But if you're from the East Coast and you're used to clapboard and painted wood, you know, and then you come out here, it's like when I used to take my students to Mexico before they all were convinced they were going to be chopped up by the cartels, and we would do field trips. Some of the people, students who grew up here in upper middle class families, were a little shocked by some of the little villages down there. And I said, you know what? These people are happy, and their Mexican food is good Mexican food. And I don't know about your religion, but they're very devout Catholics. And so, yeah, I know this is not your Rancho Santa Fe house with bougainvilleas growing around it, but absolutely. And so I think, and I don't mean to pick on religions, because, you know, I could probably do with that all night and day, but I think Protestants in particular, because Lieutenant Emery did the same thing. When Lieutenant Emery came out here to Warner Springs, I'm looking out my window right now and I can see the steam rolling off of the hot springs at Warner Springs. When Emery came here, he said the Indians are destitute, and he went on and on about they only got a thin blanket to keep them warm and blah, blah, blah. And then he starts picking on the Mexicans because they've enslaved the Indians in a way that he says is worse than we did on the East Coast with the black people. And he describes that because it's of the missions, the Catholics. So you always have to look at who's telling the story, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So all those women that weren't Hispaniolas, did they dress similarly to the, with the reboses and all that stuff?
Absolutely, because you have to fit in, right? And also because there was a status to that. So if you could get some trade beads and yours are bright and shiny, even though you're mixed blood, you've got a nicer, cooler necklace than this other woman who is Espanola. Or, if you went down to the coast with a couple of under Akumai women and you got some sea otters and beat the hell out of them and skinned them and traded that, you could get a really pretty dress. And so the next time there's a fandango, and they did dances at the Presidio, you got your beads on and you got your pretty bright new dress, right? Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Richard, may I ask you a question? It might be pretty dumb and maybe I missed it, but first of all, thank you very much. It's always so much fun to hear these lectures. Thank you, OBHS. And was George Marston just not aware of not covering up those important sites?
No, just the opposite. He bought the land because it was about to be subdeveloped. So if you know where Mission Hill stops, and then you've got the Presidio Park, it was already plotted out for 6 or 8 really big houses going down the hill. And he thought that was terrible because he knew the importance of this place. And so he bought it. And his assumption was once he got some things going, then the city would buy it from him. And that didn't happen the way he wanted it to. So since they weren't going to preserve the buildings, the city or anybody else, he talked to his friend Percy Broll, who was a city engineer, and Broll said we should just bring in dirt and cover these buildings up to preserve them because they're adobe.
Yeah,
'Cause they're all-
somebody covered them up.
Yeah, they're going to melt. So he covered them up and planted grass on top of them. Yeah.
Mm.
And that preserved.
Yeah,
More or
thank you.
less. More or less. I mean,
Yeah.
the water percolates through and it does somewhat dissolve the adobe, but not as much as if it were exposed on the surface. And when we dug the Presidio up, I could give you that talk sometime. Maybe I already have.
Okay.
When we dug the Presidio up, the walls were still 4 feet high once we dug them out. And then we hired this engineer, 1972, and said, how can we preserve these? You know what he said? Cover them up. That's how you can preserve them. He said, you could put some plastic over it, some Visine plastic, which will keep some of the water out. But on the other hand, it will trap water inside and through osmosis. He said, cover them back up, put grass back over top of it. And that's what we did.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That
So
is
Rick,
That's very interesting. Thank you, Richard. I'm a native San Diegan, and I've always wondered why it remained covered up and not properly excavated. I, as a child, was up there many times thinking there's some really interesting stuff under this this grass. So
Yeah.
that's interesting history.
There is, and I mentioned this to Johnny once because she's attended some of my Osher classes, you know, where she's very involved. If ever the OB group wants a tour, especially when COVID's over, I'll be glad to meet you on the hill there and give you a walk-in tour around there. I'll take you in the chapel. We'll stand right there by the altar. You know, if some of you want to bring your spouse, you can get remarried at the altar of the Presidio of San Diego, if you're Catholic. That's where I got married there 5 years ago.
Can we
Yeah.
smoke cigars at
Wow.
the cigar store?
And we could smoke some cigars and there could be some tequila involved, you know.
I'd love to.
Stay-
We will do that. We'll take you up on that, Richard.
All
I
right.
think that would be great. That's a
Mark.
good idea.
I
Hey,
knew-
Richard, whoops.
Yeah.
Did
Thank
you
you.
want to mention, your Imperial Valley talk you're gonna do at the Desert Museum?
Am I doing a talk?
Aren't you? I thought you were doing a talk.
No, I already did one.
Oh, you did it. Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you,
Well-
okay, that was the one about wine.
No, Johnny, I know what you're talking about. So I'm on the board of directors
Oh.
for the Imperial Valley Desert Museum. And unless you're really a museum nut, you're not going to go there because it's at the bottom of the hill as you're going out towards El Centro, Catillo, by all the big wind turbines. And at that point, if you're driving, you're trying to get to El Centro or beyond. You're trying to get to the casino at Yuma. You're trying to get to Phoenix. If you're coming back, you're tired, you want to get up that damn hill and get back to San Diego. So it's not as visited by folks like us in San Diego. It's visited by a lot of people from the Valley. So one of the things we're going to do is a fundraiser, we hope, when the museum reopens after June 10th, 15th, whatever. It's open now, but I'm going to do a wine tasting analysis because in my spare time, I do make wine. And I took lots of classes at UC Davis on winemaking, and I've studied the history of it. I have a little book out on the history of San Diego wines and wineries, by the way, if you want to contact me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour some Syrah and some Cabernet and some, you know, this and that, some Barberas and Tempranillos. And then people are going to, you know, having paid a little bit of money, then they're going to taste them. And then I'm going to ask people what they taste, and then I'm going to tell them what they should be tasting. Although our palates are all different, right? And so that it's a fundraiser as part of their new opening, and then we're going to have some music there. They haven't settled the date. We've got a board meeting, gosh, tomorrow night, I think. And I'll keep the OB people apprised of it. But
Yeah.
it's worth a drive. Amazing
It is.
collection. Yeah, amazing collections. Yep. Thanks for reminding me, Donnie. It's not that I forget things. I sometimes either overbook myself or I don't look at this little whiteboard that's to my left here. And so I remembered you because you're my favorites. And, you know, we had
There
the
you
dry
go.
run. But a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting down here I was working on this paper. And this is another paper. And my wife came down and she looked at her watch and she said, "Aren't you supposed to be doing a Zoom lecture to somebody right now?"
Ah,
and I had 1 minute, and I got on and did my thing.
Oh, that's good.
So,
Okay.
and I was this way when I was 19. This is not old age or dementia. That's going to happen. But I'm kind of scattered.
That's
So
okay.
Richard, are all those wines you're having them taste, are they all yours, or are you just bringing other people's wine?
Other people's. I'm going to bring some of my own because
Okay.
one of them I make, a Barbera, is not commonly made. So it's going to be from grapes that I grew in Ramona back before my house burned
Okay.
down.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do some local wines from up here because there's some good wines up here in the Warner Springs area and Julian. And then I'm going to do some from Bevmo, some more
Oh.
common wines. Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
old Bevmo.
And I'm going to have a handout and a quiz. I'll give you a little quiz to take first, and then I'm going to show you how it really is. And in some cases you'll be right. In some cases you'll be surprised.
Okay, so you're gonna keep us up to date on that.
Yeah. Yep.
Hey Garnett, do you guys still make wine?
Me?
No, Garnett, she's right
Oh.
below you on my screen, but she's muted, I guess. She's one
I'm
of
here.
our.
I'm here.
There.
I see her.
We lost our tree. We had the plum and apricot tree that we made the wine. Well, I didn't. My husband did, Pat. But they were at least over 50 years old or more, and they had termites. But
Oh, no.
making jam at this point. But we have a lot of trees replanted now, and so maybe in a few years we'll make some more fruit wine. It was
Fruit
very
wine,
good, especially
fruit wine can be good. Somebody in the chat asked a question about the Mission grapes. So the answer is, when the Padres came to San Diego and up and down the coast, they sent for cuttings, and those cuttings came from Peru. And it's called Mission wine, Mission grape, and it's probably a weird. I think UC Davis actually finally did a DNA study on it, and it's related to a grape called Tempranillo, because Tempranillo means first. It's the first grape that matures, and it grows like a weed, and so that would have been very appropriate for the missions. San Diego planted some, and it was never terribly successful at first, and they tended just to make brandy out of it and quote Sacramento wine. San Gabriel, Mission San Gabriel, made most of the wine south of Sonoma, and Sonoma was late, the mission anyhow. So San Gabriel exported wine all the way actually back to Spain and down in Mexico City. The viceroy in Mexico City kept ordering kegs of wine
Wow.
from San Gabriel. Yeah. And someone recently meaning the last 10 years, took some cuttings from the mission grapes at San Gabriel, planted them, and 5 or 6 years later made some wine out of it and was actually
Wow.
selling it to raise money. There's one winery in Los Angeles near the train station where the original vineyards of Los Angeles were. I can't remember the name of the place, but they still sell Mission wine made from Mission grapes. It's
Wow.
not very good to me. I'm a snob.
How far back does Mission Santo Tomas go? I'm not a snob.
They make good wine. They make good. There's some great wines coming out of Guadalupe Valley in Baja. I should go get the book off my shelf and find out for sure. But I want to say, because it was early, I want to say it goes back to about 1780.
Yeah. Okay.
Like that. Yeah. Yeah. And most of if you buy Santo Tomas wine now, most of the grapes are grown in Guadalupe Valley because it's better soil and better water. In the last 20 years, Guadalupe Valley's gone from 6 wineries to 45 to 50. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a great trip too, by the way. I'm not going to take you on that trip, but there are people who do tours, and you get on a bus and you go down there and you go to like 5 or 6 wineries, which is about all the wineries you can do in a day anyhow, if you're tasting and not spitting. And then they give you a Mexican lunch, nice lunch, and then they bring you back up. It's fun.
So Eric, I think we should plan a trip to the Presidio in the summer.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Get him before he forgets he offered us.
Yeah,
that's right. Make sure you
And then-
call me the day before.
Yeah, we'll call you the day before. Okay. Hey, thanks a million, Richard. It was wonderful. A lot of great
Yeah.
information. Thanks for being with us, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
And check the website for our next lecture, and we'll see you all later. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks, Richard.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
My pleasure.
A lot of fun.
Bye.
Johnny's still talking to herself. Johnny,
See ya.
Good night, you guys.